Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Naka Kondo from Policy and Insights of Economist Impact at the Economist Group. I'm pleased to welcome you to this event organized by the United Nations Environment Programme to launch the report, From Pollution to Solution, a Global Assessment of Marine Litter and Plastic Pollution. The objectives of this event are to, 1, present the key findings of the assessment and discuss some of the scientific findings in more detail, including knowledge gaps and emerging issues. 2, discuss policy implications of the assessment for governments, industry, and intergovernmental organizations, including in the lead up to the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA 5.2. 3, highlight the new report, Drowning in Plastics, Vital Graphics on Marine Litter and Plastic Waste, which was jointly developed with the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions and GRID-Arendal. 4th, provide brief updates on next steps, including the Global Partnership on Marine Litter, GPML, action tracks, and the GPML digital platform, which promote further stakeholder engagement and collaboration to tackle marine litter and plastic pollution at all geographic levels and throughout the life cycle of plastics. We have a great lineup of speakers today and from all over the world and from multiple sectors. So I'm sure that this will be a very informative and interesting session for the nearly 1,000 participants who have registered to attend. So thank you. I would now like to invite Leticia Carvalho, the head of the Marine and Freshwater Branch at UN Environment Programme, to provide introductory remarks. Leticia, please.
Thank you very much, Naka, and my sincere apologies, I will not be able to switch on my camera due to tech issues. Good day, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, and all the participants who are joining us from around the world. On behalf of the United Nations Environment Programme, I want to extend all of you a warm welcome to this event. Today, we are launching From Pollution to Solution, a global assessment of marine litter and plastic pollution. The assessment provides an up-to-date overview of the latest science and looks into actions undertaken to better understand, monitor, or address the issue. Marine litter and plastic pollution and its detrimental effects on people and the environment is a manifestation of our failure to produce and consume sustainably. Most plastics produced end up in landfills or the environment, in particular the oceans, where they can stay for a long time and fragment into microplastics. While I am welcoming you all and I'm convening my greetings from the Indian Ocean by the Kenyan coastline, the amounts of fragmented pieces of plastics entangled with the seaweeds, buried with the white sands, and harming the marine fauna here is astonishing. We must take collective responsibility to solve this problem. No one should be excused to take action, but producers and regulators need to champion a global solution. The assessment shows that the scale and growth of the problem calls for urgent action to stop the leakage of plastic to the environment from source to sea. We need to move from a linear model of produce, use, and discard to a circular one. At every United Nations Environmental Assembly since 2014, governments have adopted resolutions on the issue of marine litter and plastic and microplastics. UNEA 4 set the wheels in motion for the development of this assessment. 2 years of work went into it, greatly supported by the Scientific Advisory Committee, consisting of 67 experts nominated by governments and major groups. We thank the members for the major role played through the provision of valuable scientific information, data, advice, and reviews. The assessment would not have been possible without the lead and contributing authors and the reviewers. I want to extend our deep gratitude to all, and would also like to thank the government of Norway for the generous support. The assessment provides a solid foundation for policymakers and other stakeholders to grasp the breadth and severity of the issue. We hope that it will serve to inspire solutions and inform discussions at the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA, next year to further encourage global action to curb marine litter and plastic pollution. Timely communication of facts and findings from science to policy is key. In this regard, the new vital graphics on marine litter and plastic waste, drawing in plastics, complements the assessment with great and easy to understand visuals. The assessment was developed, as already mentioned, through an excellent collaboration with the Secretariat of Basel, Rotterdam, and the Stockholm Conventions and GRID-Arendal. Colleagues, addressing marine litter and plastic pollution touches on many aspects of the economy, society, and the environment. It is a multifaceted problem that requires well-coordinated multilateral solutions. We are encouraged to see the momentum building for ambitious global action to turn the tide on marine litter and plastic pollution. We look forward to enriching the exchange today. Thank you very much, and back to you, Naka.
Thank you, Letitia. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Gunmar Holm, Norwegian Ambassador to Kenya, Somalia, and Seychelles, and Permanent Representative to UNEP and UN Habitat, to provide introductory remarks for this event. Please, His Excellency.
Thank you very much, moderator, and to organizers, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the whole team behind this very important event. It's a great pleasure to attend the launch of the report today. I think, as we have already heard, no matter where you live in this world, plastic pollution affects you. Plastic litter is found absolutely everywhere, from the most remote unpopulated island in the Pacific to the high north and the Arctic sea ice. This is truly a global environment challenge that requires action at all levels, global, regional, national, and local alike. The report provides us with strong messages, the seriousness of the threat that we face, and the urgency to get in place effective solutions. The topic of plastic pollution, plastic litter, and microplastics that we just heard from the Indian Ocean beaches is subject to extensive research. Our knowledge of the sources, pathways, and impacts of marine plastic litter and plastics pollution is growing. But at the same time, the amount of plastic waste that is mismanaged and that enters our oceans is growing rapidly. We all hear this and we all know this, but sometimes the figures is a needed reminder. Projections reveal that in the next 20 years, plastic waste generation will double. Plastic leakage into the ocean will triple, and the amount of plastics in the ocean will more than quadruple if we don't act now. These figures are astonishing, they are scary, and they are a call to action now. Building on the previous decisions by UNEA, member states stressed in the decision at UNEA 4.6 the urgent need to strengthen science policy interface at all levels to inform evidence-based policy making. The ad hoc open-ended expert group called for all member states and stakeholders to recognize the magnitude and the urgency of the issue, to ensure that we base our policies, actions, and interventions on the best available scientific and evidence-based knowledge. One of UNEP's key functions for almost 50 years has been bringing together scientists and policymakers, identifying new and emerging issues that require global attention, and to discuss how we should address these global environmental challenges and to address them together. Along with our Nordic colleagues, the Nordic Council of Environment and Climate Ministers requested a Nordic report, strengthen the global science and knowledge base to reduce marine plastic pollution. The report makes the case for a new global scientific mechanism. We believe this should be an integral part of a new global response to address marine plastic pollution in a comprehensive manner. The launch of the report today comes at a critical moment in time as we start our preparations for the next session of the United Nations Environment Assembly next year. Norway believes that a legally binding global agreement will be the solution needed to provide an effective response to the urgency and the magnitude of this problem. Norway, along with a large number of countries, are calling for a decision to start negotiations of a new global agreement on plastic pollution at UNIA 5.2. I know this event today will be an important step in that direction, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Holm, for your insightful message. I would now like to invite Jacqueline McGlade, Professor at the Institute for Global Prosperity and Faculty of Engineering, University College London, and lead author of the assessment, to provide an overview of the key findings of the messages of the From Pollution to Solution assessment. Please, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much, Naka. Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished guests, stakeholders and colleagues. It's a great pleasure here to present the key findings of the global assessment that I and a group of authors have been working on together with inputs from the Scientific Advisory Committee over the past 2 years. It's been quite a journey, I have to say. Over this period, we've done an enormous amount of work, but especially in the last 6 to 9 months, there's been an exponential increase in the numbers of academic research publications that have come out worldwide. These have been in more than 15 languages and from scientists in nearly 100 countries. So, to ensure that the assessment reflects the latest, most important findings, we've tried to include results literally up until the first week of October. And with nearly 1,200 citations, the assessment level is providing so much information that, in fact, I think it's a resource in its own right. But let me tell you what these findings have really come out with. So first slide, please. As we heard from His Excellency the Ambassador to Norway here in Kenya, and starkly described by everyone who committed in the first instance to tell us about what they've observed, it's clear that the scale and rapidly increasing volume of marine litter is putting not only the health of the world's oceans and seas at risk, but ultimately ourselves. Plastics are ubiquitous, including microplastics. They've even become a marker of our life on planet Earth. They're part of something that we call the Anthropocene. And they've even created a new marine microbial habitat, which we call the plastosphere. So despite the current initiatives and efforts, the amounts of plastics in the oceans have been estimated to be up to 199 million tons. And our estimates of annual global emissions from land-based sources, although they vary, are quite startling. We're looking at something like 23 million tons a year in 2016, growing to potentially up to 53 million tons per year by 2030. So as we see this near tripling, we can imagine that the problem is not going to go away unless we take action, and urgent action. So next slide, please. Marine litter and plastics also present a very serious threat. They account for nearly 85% of total marine waste. Now, plastics in particular cause lethal and sublethal effects. We've seen pictures of whales and seals and turtles with pieces of plastic around their neck. We know that they're being ingested by fish as well as invertebrates, bivalves, plankton, worms and corals. Their effects are entanglement, starvation, drowning, laceration, deprivation of light and oxygen, smothering whole areas. And through this, plastics can actually alter the global carbon cycling through their effects on plankton and primary productivity, but also they can hurt the role of sequestration of carbon in mangroves, seagrasses, corals and salt marshes by preventing their proper functioning. So in a way, the more damage we do to oceans and coastal areas, the harder it is for these to come back and help us in the climate challenge. The additional element, though, is that when plastics break down in the marine environment, they transfer microplastics and synthetic and cellulosic microfibers and toxic chemicals into the waters and into the sediments, and ultimately into our marine food chains. Microplastics can also act as vectors for pathogenic organisms. These are both harmful to fish and humans and will affect aquaculture stocks. And when microplastics are ingested, they can cause changes both in genes and protein expression. They can disrupt behavior, they can cause disruptions to growth, and even reduce filtration rates and respiration. We even have experiments which demonstrate that our engineers, our ecological engineers, like some of the lugworms, the worms in the sediment, they take in plastics, and instead of it being food, It's plastic, so it has no energy, and so they become literally the slow worms. They become very, very, well, they become unable to build reefs and to turn over the sediments. So at every single scale, plastics are affecting us. So next slide, please. So of course we come to human health. Now, what has happened in the last 2 years with a lot of attention placed on this, we've been looking at the risks to human health from very different places. First of all, from open burning of plastic waste, to ingestion of seafood contaminated with plastics, exposure to pathogenic bacteria transported into coastal areas, and then some of the substances of concern being leached out into coastal waters. So the release of chemicals associated with plastics through this leaching is receiving more attention as much more evidence comes to light. Now, microplastics, as you'll read in the assessment, can enter the human body through inhalation, absorption through skin. They can accumulate in our organs. They can even get through into the placenta.
Du hørte det? Ja. Ja, godt. Ja.
Now, one of the challenges is that the human uptake of microplastics via seafood, although we think it's going to cause a serious threat, it's particularly the case with indigenous populations where their intensity of food is really reliant on marine species and it's their main source of food. But the difficulty is that the links between exposure to chemicals associated with plastics, even microplastics, is not absolutely clear-cut. And it's one of those areas that we have to put it on a warning note to make sure that we can keep attention placed on this so we can recognize what the widespread effects to society may be. But there is one more element that has come up in relation to human health, and that has to do with our psychological sense of what it is to visit beaches and shorelines. And COVID has really stressed how people feel very mindful of what the quality of their environment is. And we have a lot of research coming on board now, which shows that people are genuinely put off and have their psychological and mental health affected by finding beaches filled with pollution, filled with marine litter, and so on. They even have it even has an impact when they think about iconic species such as dolphins and whales being put at risk because of plastics. So all in all, whether it's our mental health, our physical health, plastics are actually not good for us or for marine organisms. Next slide, please. There are many hidden costs as well for the global economy. Some of them have been accounted for. We know that the costs of actually looking at tourism and fisheries and aquaculture, the cleanups, these are already amounting to up to $19 billion globally. But by the time we get to 2040, there is an enormous annual financial risk to businesses if governments were to require them to do the cleanup. And this could actually grow as far as $100 billion. So the comparison is the one that really comes home through the assessment, which is these are the costs, and yet we have a plastic market, which in 2020 is estimated to be around $500 billion. And in the latest UNCTAD report, if we take everything from raw materials to finished goods, could be as high as $1 trillion. Where we see the hidden costs, though, are within the marine environment. And there we see that the monetary value of losses on marine natural capital, as we call it, could actually be as high as $2.5 billion per year. So these are the hidden costs that we still have much work to do to document. Next slide, please. Marine litter and plastics are also what we call threat multipliers. Being out there in the environment is one thing, but what they can do is they can act together with other stresses, such as climate change, overexploitation of marine resources, to actually cause much greater damage than if they were just occurring in isolation. I mentioned before the kind of habitat alterations in the key ecosystems around the coast that can be impacted directly from marine litter and plastics. But in the end, some of the unpredictable consequences that will reduce the resilience of our coastal areas to extreme events will come just because of the presence of plastics in these areas. So we need to assess the risks of plastics in a cumulative affair, looking at the wider consequences. Next slide, please. So where is it coming from? Of course, we have to now turn to the land, because the primary sources are land-based. That's not to say that there aren't sources of plastics from maritime and marine industries, but the bulk of what we see is coming from the land. Half of the marine litter is coming from uncontrolled waste streams. So of the 9,200 million tons of cumulative plastic production since 1950, about 7,000 million is estimated to have gone into plastic waste. 3/4 of that has been discarded, it's been placed in landfills, it's become part of that uncontrolled and mismanaged waste stream, or literally dumped or abandoned directly into the ocean or into the environment. Microplastics can also, we understand, enter oceans from the breakdown of larger plastic items, and most worryingly, from leachates from landfill sites, sludge from wastewater treatment systems, airborne particles as you drive around, the wear and tear on tires and other items, and even runoff from agriculture as more and more attempts to minimize the use of pesticides and fertilizers by creating microcapsules using plastics. All of this is actually possibly running into the waterways and in the rivers and then running down into the oceans. We also have microplastics coming from shipbreaking, accidental cargo losses at sea, and then of course a whole litany of extreme events in the coastal areas. So all of this cumulatively means that we're looking at a prediction of cumulative plastic production of 34,000 million tons, leading to an ever-ending volume of waste coming into the oceans, unless we do something to tackle this on shore. Next slide, please. The sources are one thing, but the next thing is that actually a lot of this, if you could just go back one slide, but I'll tell the story anyway, is that a lot of marine litter and plastics occurs over decades. We've heard a lot about the ocean gyres. If you were to take a visit out to the ocean gyres, you would find some of those floating plastics, the polystyrene and so on, were actually made in the late 1990s. That means they've been out in the ocean for potentially 20, 30 years. So nevertheless, we can see this long tail of being resident out there. A lot of that is broken down and ends up in our sediments. So we try to look at different hotspots where we see the juxtaposition of large populations, where effectively plastics are blowing into the ocean, into the coastal areas. And we think this is extremely important because identifying those hotspots means that we need to focus attention to clean some of them up. But we're talking about millions of people who are exposed in areas where there are significant volumes of uncontrolled waste in proximity to those populations. Next slide, please. But it's not all bad news, because we have a huge array of technological advances that are coming up. We have a growth of citizen science activities that are improving our detection, monitoring, counting of plastics and plastic pollution. And yet still, we have to admit that there are some inconsistencies of measurements. And one of the big gaps that we have is the difference between the amount we're actually able to count and observe and the kind of figures that we have in many of our reports, which are modeled. And so we're really hoping that the 15 or so major operational monitoring programs that are highlighted in the assessment can be linked to marine litter actions on the ground, to data collection that is being done by communities, by citizens, by many other processes, including industries, helping us to understand and to encourage participation, not only to count and to observe, but also trying to reduce the amount of plastics actually going into uncontrolled waste. Next slide, please. So we have a large technological issue around recycling. And a lot of the assessment talks about what are the barriers, what are the challenges, because the numbers are stark. Only 10% or less than is actually recycled. And we know that plastic-related greenhouse gas emissions are significant. They're projected to grow to 19% over the coming decades. So this is significant when you think about what we're doing in the climate change negotiations. So at the same time as solid management, municipal solid waste is set to grow, we have to account for the fact that plastic will be a significant part of that. So a single solution strategy is not going to help, but neither are just, for example, labeling. So we have a whole discussion on biodegradation, things that are labeled as biodegradable. And sadly, we see that in many cases, we find plastics out in the environment labeled as biodegradable, but which literally are taking years to degrade. So there's a mismatch between the aspirations, the labeling, the customization, and what consumers are expecting, and our ability to actually deliver products that will not cause these kinds of problems. There are, of course, solutions that include circularity policies, phasing out of unnecessary, avoidable, and problematic products, fiscal instruments, deposit refund schemes, extended producer responsibility schemes, permits, and so forth. And there's a lot of green chemistry that we talk about. But ultimately, it's also about changing consumer attitudes, even closing the tap in regard to some virgin plastic production and services. So thinking completely differently in an eco-design world about how we might generate some of these products. So in the end, on the next slide, we sort of summarize all of this by saying that there's enormous progress being made. If I look back over the last 2 years when we first started, we were very, very reticent to talk about a global instrument. It was carefully choreographed. And now today we have not only that discussion on the right in front of us, as the ambassador has said, but also a lot of activities that are making it possible for us to think about that as a real possibility. Whether it's cities, municipalities, large firms, they're all showing efforts to reduce waste flows to landfills, regulatory processes, curbside collections, a whole raft of actions at the government level, and a lot of regulatory and voluntary arrangements being put into place. So these are all leading up to a very strong basis upon which we can go forward, and which I think one would have to say that the scientific evidence and the research is certainly there to underpin the kind of decisions and the ideas and the promoting of the different regulatory formulations that we have to make us confident that we can have a call for a global instrument that's ahead of us. So thank you very much for your time, and let me thank once again all of my co-authors who worked all across the last 2 years, and the members of the Scientific Advisory Committee for all their great inputs and writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. With this overview of the assessment fresh in our minds, I think we'd like to dive straight into our first panel. Panel 1, scientific findings. So in this session, we'd like to welcome speakers from the Scientific Advisory Committee that has been guiding the development of this assessment. They will discuss in more depth some of the scientific findings, as well as knowledge gaps and areas for further research. The panelists for this session are, and please, the panelists, do turn your cameras on when I call out your name, Cheryl Ritter-Kaur, Head of Center for Coastal and Marine Environment at the Maritime Institute of Malaysia. Hello. Winnie Lau, Senior Manager, Preventing Ocean Plastics, the Pew Charitable Trusts. Hello. Thomas Mays, Senior Scientist, GRID-Arendal. Hello. Sarah Dunlop, Director, Plastics and Human Health, Minderoo Foundation. Hello. And Tricia Angela Ferrelli, Co-Director, Political Ecology Research Center at Massey University. So each of our distinguished panelists will provide brief initial remarks about their topic, around 2 minutes, and then we will engage in what I'm sure to be a lively discussion. And we'll very much welcome questions from the audience as well. So please do share your questions in the chat box. And also, please address it to somebody that you would like to ask this question to. And now I will ask from Cheryl Ritter-Kaur from the Maritime Institute of Malaysia to get us started. Cheryl, could you tell us more about the sources and pathways of marine litter and plastic pollution, including land, riverine, and sea-based resources? Sea-based sources.
Thank you very much, Naka, for the question. I hope I'm audible, loud and clear. Fantastic. Thank you again, Naka, and a good day, everyone. This is, in fact, fundamental and the basis for the whole discussion, I would think, towards effectively addressing marine litter pollution. As we've heard from the earlier speakers, as well as the key findings presented by Jacqueline just now, marine litter is indeed a global problem, causing harm to marine life, coastal communities, and maritime activities. It also embodies an emerging concern for human health and safety. The reduction of marine litter pollution poses a complex challenge for all of us and mainly require adjustments in human behavior as well as in the different phases of products life cycle, etc., across diverse economic sectors. Hence, the identification of sources and pathways, as you've rightly pointed out, Naka, that leads to litter entering the marine environment is thus a crucial step in monitoring and effectively addressing marine litter pollution. Ladies and gentlemen, litter enters the coast and seas from diverse points of sources, which can be both land and sea-based. In general, most references have estimated that worldwide around 80% of marine litter arises from land-based sources, and the remaining 20% come from sea-based sources. Litter can be transported over long distances before being deposited onto either shorelines or settling on the bottom of the oceans and seas. A given site or region can be subjected to pollution from a number of different sources, which could be either local, regional, or distant, as litter can be transported to vast areas by ocean currents and winds. Source identification can often be difficult, especially when a particular litter item has remained in the marine environment for a long period. Furthermore, certain items, in particular fragments or what we refer to as microplastics, resulting from the disintegration of larger items, can be very hard or even impossible to identify in some cases, especially in terms of their possible origin. Pinpointing the sources of the different pollutant items could therefore be a difficult task sometimes with an inherent degree of uncertainty. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the common general categorizations of the origin of marine litter items is actually the division between sea-based and land-based inputs itself. Sea-based sources relate to litter that is directly released into the sea by maritime activities, for instance, shipping, fishing, offshore installations or dumping, or refuse at sea. Land-based sources, on the other hand, relates to activities which cause littering directly on the coast, for instance, such as from beach tourism, but it can also refer to litter generated in more distant areas, such as towns or industrial sites, and blown or washed into the sea. Being able to distinguish between the waste that is generally generated locally, regionally, or globally is hence important when deciding on appropriate measures to prevent marine litter or to address the issue. Fortunately, a wide variety of methods has been used over the years to determine the sources of marine litter, which could range from simple counts of items on the shores, for instance, believed to originate from a given source, to a more complex statistical methods that we've seen over the years. Some easily identifiable items have a clear function and can be attributed with a high level of confidence, for instance, to specific industrial or consumer sectors or points of origin. I'd like to give an example here. Fishing nets and pieces of fishing nets, for instance, are obvious examples which you can directly attribute it to a specific sector. In this case, the fishing industry. However, there are also litter items that cannot be directly connected to a particular source or pathway. Some items can have a number of potential sources and pathways of entry, as well as the geographical origins. One example that I can give here is probably plastic drinking bottles, for instance, that are left behind by tourists on the beach. It could also possibly be thrown overboard by a merchant shipment, for instance. It could be disposed or improperly handled on land and then washed into the sea through storm water and overflows and so on. So this is one example where it's a bit difficult to identify the actual source. They can then enter into the sea via rivers and easily transported to a given area by water currents and prevailing winds. Measures to combat the number of plastic bottles, in this case, for example, will need to consider all these different aspects of the sources and pathways in order to be effective. Ladies and gentlemen, the source and way of release of some marine litter items, especially fragments of larger ones, in some cases are still difficult and challenging to identify. However, fortunately enough, as also mentioned by the earlier speakers, investigation of litter in marine environment and rivers, in combination with relevant modeling systems these days and various other methods that has been introduced, could provide helpful information on their geographical origin, sources, and pathways. Additionally, there are also active accompanying efforts ongoing on establishing baselines and identifying hotspots in many parts of the world, especially in Southeast Asian region where I am currently based, unfortunately also one of the identified global hotspots for the problem. So ladies and gentlemen, ultimately, I would think that policy measures will need to address the generation of this marine litter, in particular those that can be prevented at the source, as well as their pathways, in order for us to address this issue at large. With that, I'll just stop there, Naka, and we can probably discuss further later. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to turn to Winnie now from Pew's Preventing Ocean Plastic Project. And from Winnie, please tell us about the emission estimates and projections for maritime litter and plastic pollution, taking a source to sea and life cycle approach.
Thank you so much, Naka, and hello, everyone. So in the modeling analysis that the Pew Charitable Trusts and partners conducted, we looked at the flow of plastic from production to what happens to the plastic after use, whether they become waste or is recycled back into plastic products. We focused on land-based sources of plastic into aquatic environments and analyzed various scenarios to see what impacts different solutions would have, as well as the costs, job implications, and greenhouse gas emissions for each scenario. And what we learned is that there is no silver bullet and all solutions throughout the plastic system are needed. As the ambassador and Dr. McClade said earlier, if we continue along the trajectory that we are on without significant changes, the amount of plastic going into the aquatic environments would nearly triple in 2040. This is equivalent to adding about 50 kilograms of plastic along every meter of coastline. The most effective intervention we found is reducing the amount of plastic produced and used. We also found that the informal sector plays a big role in recycling plastic, and the economics of recycling is a big driver in achieving circularity. Microplastics pollution will also require attention, as it is projected to be a growing problem. As with all modeling, we found that what we get out depends on what you put in, as well as the assumptions that are made. It will be important to continue to strengthen the data and the data sources that go into the various modeling approaches, as well as to calibrate the models with real-world data. Additional effort will also be needed to include maritime sources of plastic pollution into the existing models, as there is not yet sufficient data on maritime sources. And lastly, more socioeconomic data will help us better understand the impacts to people, society, and the environment. The good news is that our analysis shows that there is a pathway to stopping plastic pollution by governments and businesses around the world working together to implement the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. Now I'd like to turn to Thomas from GRID-Arendal, who will address the impacts of plastic in the environment and how these tie into the need for a risk framework and data harmonization. Thomas, will you speak at the importance of communicating scientific information to a broader audience, please?
Thank you, Naka, and hi, everybody. I would like to start with thanking the organizers for inviting me to this panel and congratulate everyone who was involved in this assessment. It was an absolute pleasure to share the group together with Cheryl and to be surrounded by all these top experts, but it's even a greater pleasure to see our first global assessments being produced. It's probably one of the most complete and up-to-date assessments on marine litter I'm aware of, and it's certainly going to be a good Halloween read. In terms of the impacts, and what definitely became clear from this assessment is that the impacts of marine litter are real. They are present. It's not something that could happen, it is happening. The impacts can be direct, they could be indirect, they could be lethal, they could be sublethal, they are environmental, but as you heard, they also affect human health. Some of the best knowns are probably ingestion entanglements, but there are many more impacts. Starvation, drowning, smothering, toxicological harm. We have only discovered the tip of the iceberg. The impacts have been really wide. They go to global carbon cycling effects. But earlier this year at my institute, GRID-Arendal, we assessed the exposure of coastal environments to riverborne plastic pollution. And we found that 54% of the mangroves were within 20 kilometers of large plastic pollution point sources. Also, other marine ecosystems were affected, and these ecosystems play a major role in sequestering carbon. They form our resilient barriers against climate change. So plastic is there, it's present, it's having effects, it's entering our food chains, and it definitely has negative effects if we ingest those plastics. There is not just risk to the environment, there's risk to human health, there's well-being which is affected. There is basically no escape from plastic pollution, and it's so not surprisingly that we want to define what these risks are. We do this by building risk assessments, and it's a difficult word to actually say how likely is it that the environment is impacted by this plastic pollution. We do these risk assessments because we want to prioritize, we want to see where is the biggest fire, what should we tackle first, what should we regulate. So we look at what is the exposure in the environment. We combine that with lab studies where we have effect concentrations, and that's how we try to define risks. However, there are several issues. The plastic pollution is very complex. There's hundreds of polymers, there's ranges of sizes, shapes, additives, persistent organic pollutants, equilibriums who set in, eco-coronas, you name it, and it's there. The environment itself is also very complex, and so life is not really a lab tube. So it will take a lot of time for us to develop a full understanding, and we often don't have that time. On top of that, as you heard already, there is a bit of lack of standardization. There is an absence of agreed protocols and standards, and so it makes it very difficult to combine the right evidence. So next to that, scientific evidence I would like to highlight is only one part of the solution. We still need public and political buy-in to make these changes happen, and therefore we will need to bring science to the wider audience. I would like to highlight here that we have an upcoming vital graphic report produced by GRID-Arendal in collaboration with UNEP and the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention, which gives you quite some nice graphics. And I probably have to stop there because I can realize that we're running out of time already, but I look forward to your questions in the next panel session. And with this, I would like to return the floor to you, Naka. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. So next, I'd like to invite Sarah from the Minderoo Foundation. Sarah, please tell us about the impacts on health from marine litter.
Thank you, Naka, and congratulations to the team for such a seminal piece of work. So there's the visible plastic pollution, the pollution that we can see in the oceans, and also the invisible plastic pollution that we can't see, and that's in our bodies. The microplastics, and even more importantly, the tiny virus-sized nanoplastics, which because of their small size may cross the gut and blood-brain barrier and are linked to inflammation and oxidative stress. And those are the hallmarks of hundreds of diseases that we know about. And then, of course, there are the plastic additives, the 10,000 plus chemicals that exist, plasticizers, UV stabilizers, flame retardants, to name a few, which leach out of the plastic products and get into our bodies from before birth and throughout our lives. They're with us for our entire journey. And yet we know about the health effects of only a fraction of them. They hack our hormone systems and are linked to miscarriage and the ability to reproduce. That's the very right to life. And to abnormal brain development, that's changing what it is to be human. And to chronic killers such as heart disease, diabetes, and obesity, that's the right to a healthy life. These plastic chemicals are also found in every marine species examined so far, from plankton to whales, and are also affecting their health. They change immune responses, disrupt metabolism, deplete energy, alter behavior, retard growth, and also, that key element, they disrupt reproduction. So plastic and marine litter is really destabilizing this great ecosystem provider, the ocean on which we depend for our oxygen. Every other breath that we take comes from the ocean, for our food, for our recreation, and our mental health, as Jackie described. The ocean's badly damaged, and we've got very little time to halt this global planetary threat, with planetary and human health actually paying the full cost. That's who's paying. And like others, there are solutions. We need transparency. We need to know what chemicals are in this marine litter, what's in the plastic and what's in us and what's in other marine species. We don't at the moment. We need chemical regulation that's as strict as the regulation that we have for medicines. At the moment, it's seriously lacking. And we also need to seriously rethink plastic, redesign it using green chemistry so it's safe and sustainable. And we can uphold the right to a clean and healthy environment and not go on simply using it and throwing it away and polluting our very life support system, as well as ourselves and our children. Thank you, Naka.
Thank you, Sarah. And finally, for this panel, we go to Tricia. Welcome, Tricia, from Political Ecology Research Center at Massey University. Please tell us about the disproportionate impacts related to marine litter and plastic pollution on different groups and associated environmental justice issues. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you, Naka, and thanks everybody. Thank you for being here, and it's a pleasure to see my colleagues again. It's been a while. I wish I could see you in person, but hopefully sometime very soon. So plastic pollution affects everyone and disproportionately impacts those at heightened risk of human rights violations and abuses. So I'm talking about those such as waste workers, petrochemical and plastics workers, children, women, Indigenous peoples, marginalised and coastal communities, and those living in poverty. And only yesterday, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Toxics reported that thousands of largely unregulated toxic additives, just as Professor Dunlop just shared with us, are used at every stage of the full life cycle of plastics. And these toxicants pose immediate and intergenerational threats to human rights, and all these human rights are protected under international law. These include, as Professor Dunlop also said, that rights to life, the rights to reproduction, the highest attainable standard of health, a healthy environment, housing, water, sanitation, adequate food, equality, non-discrimination, as well as rights to information, participation, and effective remedy. So human rights will become increasingly negatively impacted and will continue to aggravate pre-existing vulnerabilities and environmental injustices as global plastic production volumes rise, along with the social and economic costs of remedy. And when I say the economic costs of remedy and the social costs of remedy, I'm talking about including landfill remediation, pollution cleanups, the safe retrieval, repatriation and management of legacy plastics. So these social impacts of plastic pollution are recognised in the ministerial statement, the Ocean Day Declaration, the new Rwanda and Peru resolutions, Japan's recent resolutions. These all note the impacts of plastics on well-being, food safety, economies, and the human activities dependent on a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And earlier this month, the UN Rights Council universally recognised for the first time that having a healthy environment is a human right. And the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights also recognise the obligations and responsibilities of states and businesses to identify, to prevent, to mitigate and remediate the adverse human rights and environmental impacts of business activities, products and services, and business relationships. So plastic pollution requires a global rights-based set of responses, many different responses, complex, holistic, integrated, related responses, including the transition to a chemically safe circular economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. And I think we have a question from the floor that I have here for you, Tricia. And it says, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Hazardous Substance and Wastes, Marcos A. Orellana, gave opening remarks at the 48th session of the UN Human Rights Council. His remarks mentioned disinformation and distortion of science as two factors that threaten the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. How does this relate to marine litter and microplastics?
Okay, well, so for decades, the plastics industry, with state support, have perpetuated the myth that plastics recycling would save us. And yet we know, and the report shows, that only around 7 to 9% of all plastics ever produced have been recycled. We're also learning that plastics recycling involves the introduction of non-intentionally added substances, toxic substances, or NIAS. So individuals have been told for decades too that if only they as individuals stopped littering and started sorting their waste properly, they'd solve the problem. And as Professor McGlade noted, we're seeing too much mislabeling or greenwashing of plastics alternatives, such as compostables, as she noted. And I guess the disinformation and the distortion of science has seen vulnerable communities paying dearly with their human health. And Marcos mentioned Cancer Alley in Louisiana as an example of this. This is one of so many. So they're seeing, we're seeing these communities paying dearly with their human health, their cultural identity, and their well-being. And all the while, the global plastics production volumes continue to rapidly increase. And we've heard numbers around this, these global production volumes doubling by 2040. So Marcos Orellana was calling for the right to science. And this is important for all of us here. We need an open access and just science policy interface, which democratizes the science of plastics, which values also the knowledge, practices and innovations of Indigenous peoples and citizen scientists. So it's really great to hear that included in this report. I hope that answers that question. Thank you, Naka.
Yes, no, thank you, Tricia. And we have time for one more question, and we've got loads more, but this is to you, Thomas. And what evidence is needed to develop more direct actions?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think there is a lot of evidence out there already. So if you want to take action, I think we could look at what is out there. Of course, we need to measure it first. I think good data on what is out there, what the sources and the pathways are, is definitely necessary to take some good actions. But it's logic that we can't grow infinitely in a finite world. So we probably also have to take action in terms of production, consumption. And as been mentioned previously, if we redesign our plastic with end of life in mind, we should probably not have to deal with the waste. I hope that was the answer you were looking for. Thank you, Naka.
Thank you, Thomas. Now, this brings us to the end of our first panel, but thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Tricia. And we would like to, and thank you to the audience for sending through all those questions. Apologies, we didn't have enough time to address them all, but we appreciate it nevertheless. And now it's time to turn to panel 2. Policy implications of the findings of the assessment for governments and industry. And we would like to now invite our next panelists on board. So please do switch on your cameras. And the participants for panel 1, you may now switch off your cameras. So I would like to invite His Excellency, Ambassador Walton Webson, Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the United Nations, Christopher Vestley, International Relations Officer from the European Commission, David Vivas Ugui, Legal Officer at the Division on International Trade and Commodities, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, Kirsten Barnes, Project Lead, South African Plastics Pact for Green Cape, and Brian Bauer, Circular Economy and Institutional Partnerships at Algramo. I'd like to remind our panelists that you have 2 minutes each for your initial remarks, after which we will move on to the interactive discussion with questions from the audience and from me. So we're very keen to know from all our speakers, based on the key findings of the assessment that's just been shared, and your work on this topic, of the following. What do you think are the transformative pathways we need to take to effectively tackle the global crisis of marine litter and plastic pollution from the sector perspective that you are in? So with that, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Ambassador Walton Webson from Antigua, Barbuda. Ambassador, building on your vast experience and leadership on this issue, could you please speak to us about the policy implications on the efforts in Antigua and Barbuda as a small island development state?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and greetings to all wherever you are. Antigua and Barbuda, Madam Chair, we are honored to participate in this launch from pollution to solutions. This issue is on marine plastic pollution is one that has been with us for a long time and is of significant national importance to Antigua and Barbuda. As you know, the seas means everything to us, and it is of considerable importance to our economic activity, our food security, life as island people, and overall our social viability relies on the ocean and the seas. The key findings in the report, however, presents an important perspective of current situations as it relates to marine plastic pollution and the linkages to human health, the environment, climate change, and overall the whole global policy and the landscape on this issue. While they are all deeply insightful findings, a few things stand out for us. One, the way plastic pollution may be influencing the climate as it impacts the ability of the ocean to absorb carbon dioxide from the use of fossil fuel. Two, the slow and key accumulation of marine plastic pollution over decades, and the significant, you have all seen the trash floating. And three, the threat and multiplier impact, compounding the negative effects of climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation. These considerations are very relevant to Antigua and Barbuda and all SIDS, and we look forward to the discussions that you're having on these issues as we move ahead with the process of a global legally binding instrument on marine plastic. Finally, regarding the policy implications, the capacity building efforts in SIDS are indispensable for achieving national and global oceans related priorities to address the significant issues of plastic. It is also pivotal that an agreement addressing the very real capacity of financial challenges of SIDS and all developing countries are addressed within this, and that we must clean up the existing pollutions and implementation that these provisions still allow and provide. We also agree, and have done so for a very long time, both in Antigua and the other islands around us, that there is a need for an international binding instrument to address marine plastic pollution. We must find a solution that addresses this issue at different entry points in order to achieve our goal and our objectives. We cannot find a one-size-fits-all, but we must have different entry points, and Antigua and Barbuda has been advocating and working towards that end. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Webson. And next, I would like to give the floor to Christopher Vestley with the European Commission. Chris, would you please talk to us about circularity and relevant EU policies initiatives? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I think, and also would like to add my voice to congratulating on the launch. I think these important findings very much confirms the picture we also see from our perspective that urgent action is needed along the entire plastic life cycle, and that's also the main sources of marine litter and plastic pollution are land-based, clearly indicating that this is not only a question about the oceans, but all compartments of the environment. The findings also point towards the fact that a single solution strategy will be inadequate. Multiple system interventions are needed upstream and downstream of plastic production and use. And we know that many such measures already are emerging and present. But even with all the current major industry and government commitments, if they are met, the world would see a reduction in annual rates of plastic pollution floating into the oceans of only 7% annually, indicating clearly that we need to act at all levels, even more targeted. Now, in the EU, we have already in place some important instruments, such as extended producer responsibility for packaging. The Port Reception Facilities Directive would ensure that all waste from ships is delivered to proper port reception facilities. We're addressing intentionally added microplastics, and also looking into products in a more comprehensive approach in the new Sustainable Products Initiative that is right around the corner. So I mean, there's a menu of options. What has caused much attention is the approach we have had to single-use plastics, and I think also has been attractive to many other countries, which is a good starting point, but obviously not on the one and only solution. It has a targeted approach to single-use plastics based on the 10 most commonly found single-use plastics items on European beaches, alongside fishing gear, which represents 70% of marine litter in the European Union. It includes cotton bud sticks, cutlery, plates, balloon sticks, food containers, cups for beverages, beverage containers, cigarette butts, plastic bags, packets and wrappers, wet wipes, and sanitary items. It's important to highlight that here, even with a legislation covering these items, the different measures are being applied to different products, and it's not about banning all or nothing. The measures are proportionate and tailored to get the most effective results, and also take into account if more sustainable alternatives are available, which can be including a ban, limiting use, labeling requirements, EPR schemes, and awareness campaigns. So I believe that when we review this directive in 6 years, we will have much less marine litter coming from these items, but we will also recognize that such initiatives through these legislations are not enough, and that is why one of our key priorities is to address this issue also at the global level, and that we are then advocating for a global agreement on plastics that we believe would need to set common goals and to address plastic pollution through a circular economy approach. It should tackle plastic pollution through the entire life cycle of plastics in order to prevent plastic pollution in marine and other environments, to support the goals outlined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And I also would like to add that I think this agreement should enable countries to take further actions and also supplement existing initiatives. So once again, thank you very much. Congratulations with the report, and I'm looking forward to follow this more closely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher. And now we would like to hear from David Vivas from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. So David, would you please share with us on the implications of plastic pollution for global trade and development? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be today on the launching of this assessment. I will be reading a statement because this is coming on behalf of the Deputy Secretary General of UNTA, Isabelle Durand. So I will be reading, and then I will on the explaining and developing in the Q&A. On behalf of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, I would like to welcome and congratulate UNEP, the Global Partnership for Marine Litter and Clean Seas, for this timely assessment. It is a significant contribution in a moment where consensus towards action under the United Nations General Assembly and the multilateral trade system is building up. We consider the findings on the increase in volume and speed in accumulation of marine litters and plastic pollution up to the double of initially thought, and their consequential greenhouse gas emissions very worrisome. These findings are fully aligned with recent research by UNTAC indicating that the global trade of plastics all over the value chain, from primary to finished products, tops $1 trillion in trade annually. This is, just to give you an idea, 5% of all global merchandise trade is covered by plastics. This is 40% higher than previously thought. So the increase in scenarios and the volume in scenarios seems to be being assessed both by UNEP and ONTAC at the same time, even from different tracks. So I think that's an important element to be considered. We fully agree that marine litter and plastic pollution present a serious threat to all marine and human life, while negatively influencing the climate and hindering prospects for growth and recovery in the ocean's blue economy in a post-COVID-19 scenario, particularly in developing countries. Main ONTAC messages on moving forward are the need to: 1. Seriously consider the trade dimension of plastic pollution and identify where trade and trade policies can help, and not the contrary, including opportunities and challenges for developing countries. 2nd, improve the environmentally sound management, recovery, and recycling of plastics, particularly in developing countries that have much less capacity to do so. 3, expand trade in environmental, sustainable, and effective substitutes, non-plastics, such as natural fibers or agricultural waste, and alternatives, such as certain sustainable plastics. 4th, facilitate massive access to and transfer of key waste management and recycling and material substitute technologies, among others. Recently, ONTAC adopted a new mandate just 1 month ago for the next 4 years at the ONTAC 50 conference called the Bridgetown Covenant. This covenant states the following: it is important to ensure conservation and sustainable use of oceans and seas and marine resources, including addressing the discharge of plastic litter and other waste in oceans and significantly reducing marine pollution of all kinds, and ensuring the sustainable consumption and production patterns. These are member states, not ONTAC saying, it's a member state of ONTAC saying this. ONTAC has also been mandated to devise approaches to stimulate economic diversification and promote higher value addition in sustainable production, and to continue to support mechanisms for the conservation and sustainable use of oceans and their resources. In this regard, a key message for the assessment today: ONTAC stands ready to cooperate with UNEP in response to this new mandate and any other new mandate towards a potential instrument to address the growing marine litter and plastic pollution challenge, while pointing at trade-related solutions that are suitable to developing countries within the multilateral trade system. Thank you very much, and kind regards by my Assistant Secretary General, Isabel Dura. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, David. And now I'd like to invite Kirsten Barnes from the South Africa Plastic Pact. Hello. Would you be able to address us how a life cycle approach to plastics can be part of the transformation? Please.
Thanks so much, Naka. It's really good to be here. I like your opening statement framing this around the transformative pathways that we need to address this growing plastic pollution problem. And the urgency and the size of the problem, I think, is evident to everyone in this virtual room. And in terms of considering a life cycle assessment, what we found in South Africa under our voluntary extended producer responsibility system is that many producers in the country have been loath to look at the growing body of evidence describing and giving in great detail the impacts of their decisions and actions in terms of the products and packaging that are placed on the market. In recognition of this, our South African government has published a new extended producer responsibility regulation. So we're now very happily moving to a mandatory EPR system, and embedded within those regulations and encouraging producers to consider the full impacts of their decisions on the environment as well as on socioeconomic factors is that all producers must conduct life cycle assessments on their products within 5 years of implementation of the EPR scheme. The aim of this is to focus attention on the full life cycle. We are situated, we have a developing country context. We have 40% of our people don't have formal curbside waste management collection systems. So I think the responsibility of producers, particularly in that context, and Cheryl referenced Southeast Asia context, is maybe even higher in terms of the implications of what we put on the market and what is actually available to consumers to handle that effectively. So we really celebrate the move of the South African government to do this. And we'll also then be able to use these life cycle assessments and consideration of the full suite of impacts, and really emphasizing inclusion of plastic persistence and the effects of littering and pollution, that we'll be able to use that to design our extended producer responsibility fees to eco-modulate on not just the ease of recyclability, but the full impacts of the life cycle of those products. So we can actually make those products inclusive of the external costs. So just wondering why that the profits with the producers and the plastics industry are internalized, but the burdens and the impacts are externalized and put on the social context, which Tricia so ably highlighted. So we're looking forward to the further development of our system and the effective use of LCAs in driving us towards a circular economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. And finally, let us hear from Brian Bauer from Algramo. Brian, welcome. And would you kindly speak to us about the reuse schemes and the importance of engaging industry in efforts to prevent and reduce plastic pollution and marine litter?
Sure, Naka, thank you so much. And thank you so much to INEA 5 to inviting Algramo here. It's a great pleasure. So Algramo's a scale up in Chile. We're currently scaling into Indonesia, into London soon, into Mexico City soon. And what we do is we work with global brands. So we're currently working with Unilever, with Nestle, with Colgate, and in discussions with many other brands of that scope and scale. And what we do is we create reusable packaging distribution systems for them using IoT connected vending machines and smart packaging. So this is an example of smart packaging. This packaging has RFID technology under the label, and that allows it to communicate with Algramo's IoT connected vending machines that we co-develop for our brand partners. This bottle here, this is my bottle. It's got my digital wallet in it. I've had this bottle for 2 years, and I've refilled it almost 20 times. It's the exact same bottle that Unilever uses for its single-use system, but the only difference is that I can take the tap off, it communicates with the IoT connected vending machine, and this has been refilled 20 times over the past 2 years. Doing that, this is 133 grams of plastic, has saved over 2.5 kilos of plastic from being produced, and has saved governments the costs associated with either landfilling or recycling 2.5 kilos of plastic. So the problem with plastic is that it's very low cost, it has no value at the end of life. So what we're doing is we're trying to get people to think differently about plastic. By putting value on plastic and taking that negative aspect of plastic that when it escapes into the environment, it lasts for hundreds of years, turning that into value creation for our brand partners, for the end consumers, so that they can use the packaging over and over and over again is a really amazing opportunity. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation believes that about 20% of products in the average supermarket can be sold through reuse systems. So this is a system, this is a solution that can potentially reduce the flow of 20% of fast moving consumer good products. So that's essentially what Algramo does. And we're, like I said, we're a solution that can be applied in both emerging economies and developed economies. And we're really proud to be able to do this in a manner too that reduces the product cost, because packaging also often makes up a pretty significant percentage of the overall product cost, especially in the smaller format kind of formats of packaging. So we're able to currently in Chile to reduce Unilever's detergent costs by about 30%, while allowing lower income people to buy small quantities of product and get the bulk price, which solves for us what we call the poverty tax. So that's a brief overview of Algramo and what we do. And we're really hoping we can be one of the key players in mainstreaming reusable packaging systems on a globally significant scale. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Brian. And we've come to the end of the panel, and we have questions flowing in. So I have a question for you, Christopher. What is the role of nation action plans in furthering the work carried out at the global level?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that's a good one. I think they will play a key role. First of all, we acknowledge that such global agreement cannot come into place immediately, which of course make the actions currently going on at the national level very important in order to keep up the efforts. Meanwhile, in the future, while setting future goals and targets at the global level, I think to operationalize those into the national level, there will be a need for a clear policy at that level, making a clear direction on the national level. But that can also be the case for the region level. So this is not only a case for each country, but also for the region, I think. And that's indeed something we will highlight also in our further discussions on towards UNEA 5.2. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. And I have a question for Ambassador Webson. Plastic pollution is a global planetary threat. Can we, policymakers and regulators, private sector and consumers, move fast enough to stop the pollution?
Thank you for the question. I don't think it's a matter of can. I think it's a matter that we must. We are already seeing the effect, and for small islands like Antigua and Barbuda, this effect is across all of our social and economic development. It threatens it in a big way. So there's no can, but we must. And that's why it is so critical that come next February, we work assiduously to ensure that we have a strong legally binding instrument that will bring all of the players, private and government, civil society, to the table, and then make sure that we can all follow an instrument that will allow us to be able to reduce and stop this pollution that is destroying the planet and is a threat to the development and the economic and social development of developing countries. It's just, it is a must.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Webson. And I think we have time just for one more question, and this is for Kirsten. How is life cycle assessment informing the government approach to plastic pollution?
Okay, thanks so much, Naka. And I think in terms of the government approach, looking at the life cycle assessment, it's really been embedded in the extended producer responsibility regulations. And as SA Plastics Pact, we've been building on that particular focus area. And if you look at the Plastics Pact model, it's very much set up to integrate across the life cycle of plastics. We include organizations across the plastics value chain, recognizing that the size of the problem, as we've already discussed, and the need for collaboration across the value chain to come up with these innovative solutions to address the issues that we face. Understanding that each part of the sector has specific insights into the particular activities and actions that they take and their impacts, and they're also the best place to mitigate those impacts, if not remove them. So the system as a whole, we're working to sort of boost off the EPR focus of the government, and we're extending that ambition and engaging key industry stakeholders, focusing on brand owners and retailers as the key producers, and then working across the value chain and encouraging the members to consider their actions, to consider life cycle assessments and approaches. And thereby we are working very closely with our government department and communicating what are the impacts and what are the potential points of intervention that our members are highlighting, and how the coordination across the value chain can work with the government focus in terms of life cycle assessment to address the issue with plastics and drive a circular economy for plastics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this brings us to the end of the panel discussions and of panel 2. So many thanks again to you all, to Ambassador Webson, Christopher Vestley, David Vivas-Uguay, Brian Bauer, and Kirsten Barnes. Thank you very much. And now that we have heard from the current state of affairs regarding marine litter and plastic pollution, let us hear about the next steps that are being taken, including the Global Partnership on Marine Litter, GPML, through its 5 action tracks and the GPML digital platform. First, let's hear from Sarah Da Silva, who co-chairs the GPML on behalf of the Government of Canada regarding the GPML action tracks. Sarah, to you.
Thank you, Naka, and hello, everyone. I think you can hear me. Great. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, and all participants. I'm Sarah De Silva, the head of the Marine Litter Unit at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And as Naka said, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Global Partnership on Marine Litter alongside Frederick Haig from the International Maritime Organization. For those who don't know, the GPML is a multi-stakeholder partnership. It provides a platform for collaboration and coordination. It creates and advances solutions to marine litter and plastic pollution. So on behalf of the GPML, I'm pleased today to share some information about upcoming work that's underway. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Specifically, within this context, looking ahead at all of the incredible work that's being done and by multiple stakeholders on this topic, the GPML is setting up a series of what are called action tracks in order to advance efforts in these 5 key areas that you see here on the screen. Each of these action tracks will be operationalized through various activities, including global webinars, workshops, issue briefs on interest or of areas of interest, pardon me. So I'll start first with action track 1, emphasizing the science policy interface, which I believe will be of particular interest given the theme of today's webinar and the extensive body of knowledge that's just been presented, and recognizing the speed of which science is being advanced and that the continued momentum for action, this track is of particular importance. So this action track aims to advance and update scientific and technical knowledge for monitoring and assessment of marine litter and plastic pollution and facilitate knowledge and data transfer. It also aims to develop risk frameworks to identify priorities for mitigating economic and ecological and social impacts, including from human health. It's also looking to bridge science, innovation, and policy by promoting effective communication and understanding. And lastly, it aims to advance and update scientific and technical knowledge for combating this important issue. Moving on to action track number 2 on national level action on marine litter and plastic pollution. This track is focused on the implementation of actions, learning from what has been done before, and finding those opportunities for more harmonized approaches that still provide some flexibility to address varying circumstances. So this action track aims to support the development and implementation of national, regional, and sectoral action plans, identify marine litter hotspots, improve monitoring and governance, identify capacity building needs, as well as support project development. Moving on to action track 3, this one focuses on guidelines, standards, and harmonization, and will aim to support data and metadata documentation, interoperability, and effective use of data, as well as to engage the public and private sectors in the development of different guidelines and standards in order to enhance the sustainability of products. Then on to action track number 4, which focuses on sustainable innovative finance. This action track is under development and recognizes the opportunities for public and private partnerships. This track will aim to facilitate the coordination, for instance, of donor financing on priority topics or different geographical areas, looks to address gaps and opportunities in current funding, promote plastic conscious banking, investments, and insurance, and lastly, to develop a pipeline of investment projects. And then moving on to our last track, action track 5, which is focusing on access to all. So we've heard a little bit about this today, and this aims to address the cross-cutting and emerging issues, for instance, environmental justice, transparency and access to information, digital transformation, as well as innovation. So the implementation of these action tracks is supported by a number of stakeholders. This includes the Joint Group of Experts on the Scientific Aspects of Marine Environmental Protection, or GSAMP as most people know it, the University of Wollongong, the University of Georgia, IMO, UNEP, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, GRID-Arendal, Ocean Conservancy, Global Ghost Gear Initiative, and others, including the members of the steering committee of the Global Partnership on Marine Litter. These action tracks are going to provide value to global efforts by regularly connecting key stakeholders and helping to facilitate this coordination and collaboration of these ongoing and emerging actions. So with that, we invite all of you to join us in these efforts, and UNEP will share additional information about these action tracks following this event. And I believe they were going to also provide a link in the chat box, but stay tuned for additional information. And we would also like to take this opportunity to invite you to join the partnership if you are not a member yet, and contribute to the shaping of the development of the GPML digital platform, which someone will present right after me. So thank you for your time, and thank you for the presentations earlier.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Next, let's get an update from Heidi Savelli, Marta Otogali, and Danny Ghaffari from UNEP about how all the wonderful information that we have learned of today can be channeled to a broad audience and how you can access the information. These channels include the Clean Seas campaign and the Global Partnership on Marine Litter digital platform. So over to you, Heidi, Marta, and Danny.
Thank you so much, Naka, and thanks all for participating. As we've heard, a vast amount of knowledge and information has been generated, and we are committed to channel these through various avenues, including the Clean Seas campaign, which will be relaunched in November with a source-to-sea focus, ensuring that we're looking also at the landlocked countries and how we can support and how we can engage with these countries and other stakeholders in the fight against marine litter and plastic pollution. So additional information and links will be shared in the chat. The second avenue is the Global Partnership on Marine Litter, the digital platform that aims to connect stakeholders, integrate and promote data sources, and also knowledge exchange. So these different types of avenues will be an opportunity to engage, and we hope all of you, in both sharing your vast knowledge, but also in ensuring that the knowledge that has been generated today will be made available and accessible to all. And this will be the shorter remarks from our side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heidi, Marta, and Danny. Today, we've heard experts address the key findings of the assessment from pollution to solution, gathering latest scientific research on the issue of marine litter and plastic pollution. And as Letitia mentioned at the beginning of this event, is the result of 2 years of collaborative work supported by 67 scientific advisors. It provides a wealth of information and identifies various knowledge gaps and emerging issues that requires our attention. Our wonderful panelists discussed policy implications of the assessment for governments, industry, and intergovernmental organizations. Excellent work is underway by many around the world at all geographic levels, from source to sea and throughout the life cycle of plastics. We hope that the assessment that we've shared with you today will indeed help us to further move from pollution to solution. Thank you all for your time and attention. Thank you and goodbye.